Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for attending this lecture today. My objective is that by the time we leave this room, you will know more about Khayyamiyya, Egyptian tent maker applique, than almost anyone else in the world. And of course, this could not be possible without the assistance of the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art. So thank you to our patron for bringing this together, as well as the help of Deborah Clark, our director, and our public programs team, Carol Kuok, Paige, Sharon as well in curation, Bethany in the collections research area, and Dawn in the archives, who have contributed images to this lecture. And of course, I'm sure there's a cast of thousands behind the scenes who make it possible, so thank you all for your help. Today, I wish to speak about the work of Doris Duke as a collector, specifically in the art form of Khayyamiyya. Now, for those of us who speak Arabic, Khayyamiyya is an unusual word. It is derived from the term khayyam, tent, and Khayyamiyya, the embellished tent, the art of the tent. So we're taking tents further than usual into these extraordinarily decorative appliques, in which each piece is a hand-appliqued piece of fabric sewn using a needle-sewn applique technique. So from these, I'd like to take us through an overview. We're going to talk about the discovery of Khayyamiyya as an area, a new chapter in Islamic art history, or Egyptian art. Within that, Doris Duke's specific personal contributions, which were substantial, and then moving into Khayyamiyya in context, where I'll be taking us fairly quickly through the Khedival, which is the period from 1867 to 1914. These are the period in which Doris Duke's panels reside. Moving into the architectural format, which is evoked by the way in which Doris Duke displayed her textiles, and then into the unexpected genre of the touristic Khayyamiyya, which are strange little objects, but very important for the discipline today, finishing towards the contemporary and the future. And just to show you here some of the individuals working on these objects. These are tent makers of Cairo, known as Khayyamin or Khayyami. They're working now on a Suradek panel, which is an enormous pavilion, easily larger than the room we're speaking in today. And I'll show you some more images of these in their full splendor as we move through our lecture. John Feeney was a New Zealander who was also the first person to publish the word Khayyamiyya in an English language article back in 1986. In fact, he was one of only 4 individuals who have written anything scholarly on the art of Khayyamiyya before I came in about 2012. And my first contribution was to write a map to the street of the tent makers on Google, it's still there, and the Wikipedia entry, which needs updating. But let's continue from here. This is where, for me, Khayyamiyya started, the holotype, the first known example. I was writing a lecture for my students at Charles Sturt University in Australia on the work of the Fauves and Henri Matisse within this. And I was looking for a new image by Matisse, something I wasn't familiar with, just to make the lecture more interesting for me. And this caught my eye because of the amount of black being used, not a characteristic color of Matisse. And then realized that this Egyptian curtain is what I was familiar with as Khayyamiyya in Cairo in the streets where my parents had been living at the time, but I'd never seen an old one before. And this idea of seeing an older version, which was different, more fluid, more organic, more black, that made me realize maybe there's something to this art form that hasn't yet been studied, or where are they in museums? And the short answer is they weren't in museums. They had not been studied. This was an undiscovered chapter in Islamic art history. The first thing there, of course, was to try and find images of the original applique, because Matisse, as many of you may be aware, was an avid collector of textiles, particularly from the Middle East and Islamic world. So this was the Egyptian curtain in his collection. The text at the top is a reference to a second half of a phrase, the one who is generous is blessed, the one who is greedy is lowered, abated. And that's what we're seeing in this panel at the top. His panel is quite different to the ones collected by Doris Duke. His is a kind of lively, organic, vernacular quality, quite rough by comparison to the pieces we see here, which are definitely made as a higher-end product. But Matisse loved his Khayyamiyya. It appears in his 1948 painting now in Washington, D.C., Egyptian with the interior with Egyptian curtain, but it also appears in much earlier works from the 1920s as a backdrop, as an image that reinforces a kind of odalisque harem scene, this Orientalist fantasy of so much of his earlier work. And this image is a good example of how he used it as a living textile in his house, in a manner not unlike our patron Doris Duke's use of Khayyamiyya textiles. It was great fun trying to find these rare things. So far, we know of approximately 200 individual Khedival panels in existence worldwide, and finding them popping up in the backgrounds of images is their most common state. In this case, Marianne Faithfull, so we have a connection now between the Rolling Stones. Marianne Faithfull was a partner of Mick Jagger, in case you're not otherwise familiar, and Kiamia, the backdrop of the bed, and also Ellen Pompeo from the Grey's Anatomy happens to feature a piece behind her house. So we call that the Pompeo panel as a result. But from here, let's bring us to our own situation here in the glorious Shangri-La. We are seeing right now a scene quite similar to what we have today of Doris Duke in her dining room, next to an Indian textile that has nothing other than technical relation to Kiamia applique. The pieces of applique were probably just off camera here at the side, more or less where they are now, as shown in this scene here. Now, as we are speaking about, have you all had a chance to see these in the flesh recently? Excellent, very good. The panels that Doris Duke collected are a bit of an enigma in some ways. These were some of the first pieces that I saw when researching the history of Kiamia, and I'd always wanted to see them because they seemed so complex compared to the panel that Matisse owned. These were really very fine applique with consistently even stitching, almost invisible in fact, and calligraphy that was conspicuously finely made. Much Kiamia calligraphy is quite simply illegible because of the way it's been written, but these pieces are texts mostly from the Quran, so it's quite unusual to find a source as revered as that in the vernacular art form, Kiamia. From these, there's a few images I'd like to show you now, which I saw yesterday in the flesh. These panels have almost never been displayed. These are pieces of what I believe is a complete Egyptian tent in the collection of Doris Duke's papers. And this is a wonderful thing to have encountered because only approximately a dozen of these tents are now known, mostly in collections of individuals comparable to Doris Duke. So what we're seeing here is a piece that I believe was a doorway or an awning that would have marked an entranceway, displayed inverted. So we would see this side, the decorative side, upon entry to the tent. These panels, we believe, could have been a ceiling space. It's a very large panel with no calligraphy, and also a pattern that might remind us of the Hawaiian quilting tradition, in which you have the applique cut from a central piece that's folded over in the center here. Also, the conspicuous geometry of this piece, and the one orientating piece of bunting at the base there that hangs in the base of all these panels. These are also displayed in the dining room of Doris Duke. I believe they were not intended for wall display. I think what we're seeing here are cushion covers or seat covers for something like a round ottoman that would have laid down the edges at the side. The patterns of use are also consistent with one's placing oneself in the middle of the map patch over there. I think these are also relatively recent acquisitions compared to the earlier Khedivals. I would date these perhaps to the 50s, maybe even 60s. So she was clearly referring to Kiamia at least 3 points in her collection: the complete tent, these seat covers, in my view, and the Khedival panels, which are my personal favorites. These are, I have to say, extraordinary at close range because of their intricacy of detail, the care given to the calligraphy, which is unusual, and the fact that they do display the hallmarks of what I would call typical Khedival Kiamia. Matisse's work was more fluid and open. These are more disciplined and formal in the way they're presented. And I have to say, too, the coloration and patina that has changed through exposure to the elements here at Shangri-La has not, in my opinion, detracted from their beauty. I think we're seeing much more subtlety in the organic vegetable dyes that were used to make the panels. What we are seeing here as well is a piece with the translation at the top, just to give you a sense of what the poetry of the tent makers is like. In this case, it's from the Quran, which is unusual. Most Khedival panels feature folkloric sayings, blessings, what I believe are song lyrics as well, things that are not otherwise recorded. But in this case, I think the fact we're seeing text from the Quran is an indication of a commission. And that is not out of keeping from what I've seen of Doris Duke's collections elsewhere. I think these are serious panels that were made to an older design at the request of Doris Duke or one of her buyers in Cairo. So that's the perspective I come from looking at these very closely. And again, the panels are so consistent in their design yet different on their individual details that I believe these Khedival panels are from the same workshop. This is particularly interesting for us now because the more we can learn about the ownership of individual panels, the more attribution we can do in the future. So we can say from the workshop of Doris Duke's panels as a way of working without knowing the names of the tent makers. I'm showing you this as an unusual panel which I believe is a sibling of Doris Duke's work. This is a piece called the Thatcher panel, not after Margaret Thatcher of the UK. We are looking here at a piece collected by Ada L. Hunzinger Thatcher, who might be familiar to you. She was a heiress to a banking fortune in California, and she traveled through the Cairo in approximately 1910. And she brought back this piece, the Thatcher panel, which is now on display in Malaysia. It is larger than the wall behind us here. It is an enormous piece. Question there. Could well be. I don't actually know, but I would not be surprised if she were. Certainly she had a number of philanthropic causes, not unlike Doris Duke as well. So it's a certain kind of traveller who brings these things back. This is the top-end Khedive Khayamiya, things that are literally from buildings, magnificent in scale, very fine intricacy of design. So the work over here, the finer components in the corners in particular remind me of Doris Duke's work, as do some of the Arusa, which is the red border surrounding the edges of this pattern. Now, one of these things is not like the others. What we are seeing here are the familiar Doris Duke panels, aren't we? But one of them is a bit different. Does any strike you as being different here? The center one, very good, because the two on either side are the same pattern being repeated. In fact, the different one is this one over here, because that is a replica made about 2 years ago. So what we are seeing now, the most important thing about what Doris Duke did, has two elements. First of all, she collected Khayamiya and saw it as a serious art form within Islamic art heritage. And that was unusual. There are almost no Khayamiya represented in major museums. The Met has none. The Free Asakla museums, none again. Basically, looking at other major American museums, you won't find Khayamiya. You will find them in private family collections only, because these are contemporary visual culture, not the older materials that museums prefer. But this piece was shown. This piece over here, the original in Doris Duke collection, was shown on a mobile phone video screen to this man, Ahmed Naguib, who is a tent maker of Cairo, still working in the street of the tent makers today. And he loved this design. We actually showed him the image on a mobile phone to ask him what did he know about the names of the parts, the components. Could he tell us anything of the stories? Sadly, he couldn't. This is his grandfather's generation. It wasn't really part of his life story. But he loved the design, he really respected this, so he went on to make a copy based on what he saw on the mobile phone. So quite remarkable. The skills are still there to do this work, even though the art form itself is dying. But he loved this, made the copy, and is now in the collection that we are showing in Malaysia, as well as another copy in the UK. But from here, he fell in love with the idea of recreating the Khedivals, creating what we call now Neo-Khedival Khayamiya. And this is a panel that's owned in the only museum in Cairo to have any Khayamiya whatsoever, the Agricultural Museum in Doki. And these three framed pieces, there's another piece, well, not in this picture, he copied this one at the top, making a contemporary version in what he felt were the original colors, not copying the faded elegance like we have in Doris Duke's versions here. He also is known for copying others. Copyright in the street of the tent makers is a very informal thing. In fact, if you want to protect your design as a tent maker, you simply show your work facing into your little shop so no one else in the street can see it. Because if someone else sees it and makes it from their own memory, that counts as their copy. So, what we're seeing here is actually a panel based upon an Ottoman ceiling, not unlike the kind of painted ceiling we have here, in fact, but it's in the Islamic Arts Museum in Malaysia. So they were very happy to show this part of the exhibition we're showing there now. But I want to take us back a bit. It's always tempting with Egyptian material culture to try and find an ancient parallel to the present day. I feel that trying to connect contemporary Khayamiya, cotton appliques, to the work of the Pharaonic period is a stretch. But there is one thing that does have parallels. What we are seeing here is a funerary canopy placed over a boat that would have carried the deceased down the Nile to be buried on the west bank of the Nile. So we have the mourners above and so on. But those appliques, we know of many of these tented structures made in dyed leather. We know many of them from images, from tomb paintings, and we know one of them in the flesh. This is a detail of a very early leather applique tent in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, the only one known of its type, which was discovered in a tomb in 1883, which had been looted. In fact, it was covered in dust and rubble and was left behind as just a piece of rubble in the corner. When the first person to unveil this picked it up, realized it was leather, it was so supple it felt like it was made only 2 days before. It was still that flexible, according to the story. Then he took it out into the bright daylight to get photographed. I know, potato crisp effect. But still, the work itself does have parallels with the way color is applied, with the way sequences are used, and the tent makers are happy to call upon this as a precursor to the work we see today. In fact, I think more legitimate as an origin for the art of Khayyamiyya are the work of the Mamluks and Fatimids. If we look back at the Fatimids 1,000 years ago, we hear travelers' stories of decorated tents raised for weddings and such, but no pieces of them survive. With the Mamluks about 500 years ago, we see pieces of applique which are indistinguishable from Khayyamiyya applique today. The technique is identical, even the movements of the foliage is very, very similar. But this is where we really start seeing Khayyamiyya. What we are looking at there were stories and fragments, but now we have complete tents from the Ottoman era. The Ottomans were very well known for their decorated tent heritage. They used these as political statements where they would surround a siege of a city at the most militaristic expansion into Europe, and they would bring in negotiations to tents like this to show you that they had an army surrounding your city, but that was just a tip of an economic powerhouse that could support this kind of luxury on a campaign. So these tents are much more eloquent and elaborate than the forms of Khayyamiyya we see today. This is the apex of the art of tent making. However, as the art historian Nohan Atasoy documented, this form of tent making waned with the demilitarization of the Ottoman Empire, and it only survives today in Cairo because of different taxation systems. This is a long story, but we'll move through it quickly. This is more typical of a complete Egyptian tent these days. As you can see, it's smaller, but no less beautiful, is it really? This is the piece that is owned by the Islamic Arts Museum in Malaysia, forming the centerpiece of their exhibition at the moment. And it is proudly inverted for this photograph. Like much Islamic architecture, the beauty is the inside. So you walk into what seems like a fairly ordinary canvas structure to be surrounded on all sides by pattern, color, movement, and calligraphy. And in this case, the calligraphy is a piece in the Qasida genre, which is a poem, or ode basically, to the beauty of landscape, to the bride, and to the benefit of fresh, healthy air like we have today from the ocean. So that's basically what the poem is about in this case. On the inside, when seen in this case, here's an American example. I actually don't know where this tent is nowadays, but there's many images of the tent collected for the Sniff's Date Farm in California as a tourist attraction. So quite good for that. They had translations and so on. But the panels here are showing you how you'd have individual sections. And I believe this is what Doris Duke has collected here. Individual sections of a tent, perhaps a square format. So something like this in her piece. We don't have the poles and the awnings for it anymore. Don't know what happened to those, but the pieces are consistent with this format. Finding Khayyamiyya, however, in its original context becomes quite a challenge when we're dealing with pieces that are taken as souvenirs by tourists, stripped of their context as a result. What we're seeing here are some of the earliest known photographs of Egyptian Khayyamiyya in Cairo. Emil Bashard's ulama, Islamic scholars. Here is actually the oldest known photograph of Egyptian Khayyamiyya in its context. It's a more lively panel, perhaps in Doris Duke's, but again, a bit rougher. The text at the top is opener of doors, open the best door for us. It's actually the same thing I have written in my wedding ring, and it's a folkloric saying still used today in Cairo. It's not from the Quran. And interestingly, the same photograph was used as the basis for this painting by Walter Charles Horsley, Unwilling Evidence. It's a piece of Orientalist schmaltz as a subject, but the details are lovely. He's looking very carefully at the Khayyamiyya that appears behind Emil Bashard's work, using it here in this context, even using the seating arrangement, and I think the model who appears just over here. So he's referring to it in different ways, but my discovery for this painting was he wasn't only referring to this photograph, he's referring to this one, which is another Khayyamiyya in context by Gabriel Legekian. In this case, the Khayyamiyya is a different panel, but that doorway at the back, the window over here, the space between the door and the window, that is the same setting. So he's combined two different images to create the new Orientalist scene, reviving this idea. This was a particularly exciting recent discovery. We'd known of this painting of a single Khayyamiyya panel being used as a windbreak by Henry Brockman Knudsen, but only recently at auction in France did this quite badly damaged panel turn up. And it's the same panel, as far as we can tell. Every detail of it is consistent with the painting, except, of course, for the calligraphy, which has been quite neatly removed. This is, the message, by the way, says, victory unto Allah and a swift result. So messages like that. Very common in Islamic art, that particular phrase. This is one of the sadder stories. It's a beautiful Khedival panel, I would say very similar to some of the work of Doris Duke's collection, but it was acquired at a time when people still did not know the word Khayamiya. This is a recent term after all. It was called an Arabic quilt, a hanging, and it was seen as a one-off object donated to the University of Tennessee by Lewis Bailey Aldiger, again a traveller perhaps in the league of Doris Duke. But when we are seeing this now, it was given to the museum but deaccessioned for a very low amount because it didn't fit with anything else they had. It was a one-off object, and that is so consistently the case with Khayamiya as an under-researched form of Islamic art heritage. I'm showing you this one now as a piece that's currently in Malaysia, the Milan panel, but mostly for the poem. Many forms of guilds or workshops in Islamic art history have a distinctive poem or trade motto where they use puns which relate to the nature of the work itself. In this case, the puns include an Arabic reference to stretching fabric, the actions of scissors, and a measurement used particularly for selling fabric. But the text appears, "Look again, you will see a beautiful work. Behold, I have shown you the proof. In Egypt, the beauty of every art. To reveal this, I need a long explanation." So quite a beautiful poem evocative of a longer story, and in this case also showing the date, which is just up here. But that poem is found consistently on Khayamiya and in no other registry of Arabic epigrams. So it's distinctly the tent maker's poem. And interestingly, of Doris Duke's tent, there is a line from the same poem, "Look again, I have shown you a great work." So it's nice to see the continuity within the collection here. More examples to show you the diversity of Khedival Khayamiya. There is tremendous range in style, in color, in intensity, and we are hoping over time to be able to attribute more workshops specifically within the Khayamiya movements. So it's still an early field, but future research should be able to expand upon this. These are panels found in Ohio and New York City. So they're still out in private collections now. Also, the other work of the tent makers of Cairo. They made tents, they made wall hangings, they also made Sufi banners, in this case, processional banners that are used for religious events. So they had quite a range of work. They were also very proud to be associated with the Hajj pilgrimages to Mecca, where they created an extraordinary device called the mahmal, which is a kind of canopy that's carried in the back of a camel all the way to Mecca from Cairo. But from here, another example of the tent room in context. This is the UK, the Dodington Hall tent room, which I went to back in 2013. It is it will probably fill this space quite easily as an area, but even then it's still folded in upon itself. It would need another story to get another height to its full height, and as you enter it, it has an enormous awning like an archway that goes out the front like this over the entrance. So it is a spectacular object. But again, this is the only known living example of the Khayamiya Surah deck from the Khedival period. And these are Surah deck at their full scale. You will see how they work as a kind of tent city. What we are seeing right now is a collection of individually decorated tents with those huge awnings at the front brought together for a Mawlid festival. There will be singers, there will be recitals, there will be food performances and so on in these tents. And for a sense of scale, noticing here the decorative applique work with the pattern resembling stars, but also that's a human being there for scale. These things are like the Ottoman tents made for opulence on a grand scale. Very few photographs and images exist of the complete Khayamiya tents, but this is one of the few known watercolors of the scenes. The fair showing you basically a more useful, perhaps, research image for us rather than this bird's eye view over the tent city. Oh, pardon me, backwards one. You also find Khayamiya frequently as tondo or awnings over streets in Cairo. Many times these Khayamiya covers were just simple canvas, but often they use applique patterns hidden away in details. I also have here for you a sense of the ceremonial context of Khayamiya, in which we are seeing now the funeral procession of one of the Khedives of Egypt, where his cortege is moving from the decorative tent inside and out to a retinue of guards, moving within again, in this case, unusually decorated both inside and out as a royal tent. And again, moving through the streets of Cairo, where VIPs, where dignitaries, where well-wishers would gather in the tents to farewell the person as they move through the streets and cities. These tents were used for weddings and funerals, for graduations, for student rallies, for all manner of things, much in the same manner today. Only today, there are a couple of key changes. Tents like this were traveled with the royalty in this case. So that tent was sent in advance of events where they would sit to open, in this case, a fabric factory, a cotton spinning factory in Egypt. And again, in real life, that would have been red, white, green, yellow, and black. So really intense, bright colors. And again, also sit for royal females as well in this case. There's no real gender association with Khayamiya, except the act of making it is usually performed by men. This is an example of the type of suradek which is more usual in Cairo today, entirely handmade. Every single stitch put together by hand as a giant patchwork quilt using a series of modular panels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this case, and others at the top up there, and assembled using, as you can see here, street light fixtures. This is a street light which has been attached to as part of the overall awnings. Even the tree is built into the tent structure. So they're quite informal architecture. They pop up where they're needed. And today we tend to see these most of all. I have a piece of this here today for you. So thank you, Paige and Melinda. I'm going to hold this end up. Thank you very much. Now, should open out middle way? Yep, there we go, midway. Perfect. Now I'm holding up for you a piece of imitation Khayamiya. Now this imitation Khayamiya is a bit of a problem. It is making Khayamiya accessible to anyone who wants to use it, so it's very cheap. But as you can see, it's a factory printed fabric. It is not hand applique. Once this was invented in around the 1970s, the movement of the tent makers itself plummeted from over 300 individuals to less than 40. So this basically wiped out the industry. Thank you very much, Paige and Melinda. Thank you. So this fabric is basically in some ways making it accessible but also wiping out the industry. People now see Khayamiya as a cheap tinsel-like product which is just put up and decorative like Halloween festival celebrations. It is not seen as having prestige of a royal patron as it used to have. So what you're seeing here is the imitation. From a distance, very similar, but in practice quite different. The Street of the Tent Makers. Has anyone had a chance to go to Cairo, by the way, and seen this in person? Oh, lucky thing. Very well done. Very well done. The Street of the Tent Makers is not necessarily on everyone's visiting list in visiting Cairo these days. It is about 2 kilometers south walking distance from the Khan el-Khalili, the main tourist districts, and it is one of the last covered markets in Cairo with the original roof that was installed around 1610, 1630. It has long been known as a traveller's market for leather goods and camping supplies, but now, since the 1860s, it has been primarily the residence of the tent makers. It is really the heart and soul of the Khayamiya industry, where pieces are made along this street and in workshops nearby, sold and interacted with in this space. The individuals who make the Khayamiya, the tent makers of Cairo, are urban artisans. They are not well recorded in archives. The study of these individuals is really what we might call prosopography, which is the study of an anonymous group of individuals through what we do know about them as shared characteristics. And quite often, it's actually the objects themselves that tell us more about them than any other documented archive. So when we're looking at the objects they make, we're looking for the spelling errors in calligraphy as indications of education. We're looking for their taste of the poems being used. Are they telling us about patron or the makers? And also images like this, where we see in this case a royal crown being made. We think that was commissioned for a khedive. So this is a sign of a respect for the industry in Cairo, which has since faded and changed, becoming more of a tourist-focused industry, as we see in this image now. What's different about this Khayamiya in the background? Egyptian motifs. Yeah, we're seeing pharaohs now. This is the beginning of the touristic period. The single greatest change of the Khayamiya was not the imitation Khayamiya that wiped out the industry. It was the touristic pieces. Now, touristic pieces are made to be cheap, small, colorful, playful, and appealing to tastes that are not Egyptian. This is the Egyptian tent makers projecting an external idea of what Egyptian culture is to sell it to people from overseas. I'm sure in Hawaii we've seen similar appropriations of our cultures where it's being pitched to overseas audiences. And this is a kind of embracing of Orientalism in a sense. Luckily, we were able to find the original panel shown in the McLeish image on eBay, of all places. This is where they turn up. They're not seen in museums, as I said earlier. These were not prestigious objects. But the pieces themselves are important to us because they were collected and moved around the world as a result. We've actually know a great deal more about the touristic period than we know about the khedivials, which is my research main focus area. These two panels are fully provenanced to the individual who brought them back from Cairo and when, because they were soldiers during World War I, World War II, and nurses. In fact, I've seen Australian dramas said about Australian nurses during World War I, where they happened to include the detail of the nurses' bunks with Khayamiya over the back. And I was cheering at that point. That was great. but from here. We also have these images, of course, too, of soldiers collecting these souvenirs quite actively. They are not perhaps in keeping with good taste. They were riled against by the writer Douglas Sladen, who wrote about the magnificence of the ones used for mosques and the trashiness of the ones bought by tourists. So interesting comparisons here. And again, the way they were choosing their sources, given that these are figurative designs in an art movement not known for figuration, they were looking at what the tourists were actually buying. They were looking at postcards. But my favorite reference to the provenance of these images was actually some of these early books of Egyptian art that clearly the tent maker workshops were buying and using in-house as manuals. So we have here Perrault and Chipiez with one particular scene of a water tournament. Fine, that's nice, it's similar, but how do we know it's the same book? Because there are other pieces a few pages later referring to these two prints. Note, figure 8, figure 13, just a few pages apart. We have a mongoose-like creature stealing the eggs of birds in nests, and we have a dramatic scene of a pharaoh slaying his neighbors as they drive down the chariot. Next slide. This is a touristic Khaimia that combines these scenes. And we are seeing not only this, but the very unlikely quality of a left-handed pharaoh driving his chariot through a swamp. That wouldn't happen. So what we are dealing here is a kind of fictional imagination. They're making works that they think will sell. But notice just how fine that applique is. This is on the level of embroidery, really. The hieroglyphics are copied superbly. And this is something we don't necessarily see even in Arabic calligraphy, where we see mistakes. There are, of course, variations in quality. Some are very basic, very rough. But this is, for me, the indication of the point where the tent makers changed their work from architecture to art. And this is the change that keeps them going in the present day, in the era after imitation Khaimia, that takes away all demand for architectural scale work. They also collaborated. I believe this is a French jacket that was taken to Cairo by an expatriate, who don't know who or don't know when, but it is now in the Fashion History Museum in Canada, a recent acquisition for them, where I believe the jacket was taken to the street of the tent makers and embellished with these Egyptian revival motifs, perhaps in the era after Tutankhamun's tomb excavation. So, I'm also showing you here the perhaps sad reality of Khaimia in Egypt today. That is an original applique tent being used as a tarpaulin on a building site. Yes, that's covered in dust, tears, and conditions that are really quite appalling for the ex-textile. Imagine using your grandmother's quilt in this manner. We wouldn't do it. But that is not a judgment against the way it's being used here. The thing about this use, remember, Khaimia is a celebratory fabric. It is used for the most important events in your life, your graduation, your wedding, your funeral, whatever. Who would want an old Khaimia for an event of that importance? You'd want the bright new ones that show the dignity of the individual you're celebrating. So the old ones, in this case here, being reused as a tarpaulin, at least it's still in use. There's actually a few patches on this particular piece, hard to see in this image, but they're just down the side over here, where it's been patched with pieces of imitation Khaimia trying to color match the original applique. So there is care in this. The difference is that it's not the care you might expect of a museum piece. It's using a thing as a recycled object, giving it a second purpose. But that brings us to the new patrons of Khaimia. Quilt makers are, in fact, more important for the future of Khaimia than museums, as a general statement. What I'm showing you right now are two particularly influential quilt makers along the street of the tent makers. We have here Bonnie Browning, who is the executive director of shows for the American Quilt Society, the AQS, who is a real leader in Khaimia revival in the USA. And Jenny Bowker, who is my mother. She's also known in the street of the tent makers as al Khaimia, which means mother of the tent makers. So she is highly respected there. I don't have a name like that, she does. But what we're seeing here is an expedition to collect pieces that are then shown at the American Quilt Society shows across the USA, at Grand Rapids, Paducah, areas like this. And it's a surprising introduction for many people to Islamic art through quilts, through a very similar affinity of work. And this is an example of the way they are displayed in quilt shows. Quite like any other quilt, really. They're very similar objects. They are 3 layers held together by fabric with a batting in the middle, definition of a quilt, but made in quite a different manner. So the scale of the work here is indicated by the individuals who are working. That's Hossam and Tarek over here. And in this case, one of the most important things about the show of the art of Khaimia is the skill of the tent makers themselves. They move incredibly quickly with their needles. There is a phrase among the street of the tent makers, "A slow stitcher has a hungry family." So these men are professionals. They don't see themselves as like an amateur hobbyist quilter. They are in this for the living. The work we are seeing here as well is echoed by a work in Vienna, the World's Exposition's 1873 in this case. I find it remarkable here we have also the woman being guided through the space in the wheelchair, just as we saw in the first scene here as well. So quite a remarkable issue. But it also raises issues. Is this fair to the tent makers to represent them in this manner? I try and make sure it absolutely is, because we are giving them their own voice to talk about their art form on their own terms. If we have a tent maker present, we don't answer questions around it, we let them speak for themselves. This also does mean that the future skills of the tent makers include the large needle, the large scissors, that's always how they work, maybe a thimble, and a passport and English. These are the future things that keep the industry alive. But from here, there's also future work being done with the Kiamia. This is a Khedival panel, which is my own personal collection, what we call the awning. And we're using a system of gigapan photography here, experimental for a new tactile system. Has anyone here previously heard of gigapan photographs? They're quite remarkable. You may have seen it before at the inauguration of President Barack Obama, where they took a photograph from the mall in Washington, D.C., where you can zoom in on anyone's face from a single photograph. Quite a remarkable thing. But basically it's operated here by a regular camera on a robotic tripod that takes a series of photos. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like this. So from this distance, approximately the same length of this room, we get photographs like this, which are quite lovely, but then we can zoom in even further. So not only that, but that is the scene of this photograph taken from the other side of the room. So it is a remarkable high-fidelity resolution being done here with this experimental new system. Gigapan photography has previously been used for large-scale landscapes, big crowd events and so on, but textiles like this are a new frontier for us. And we're using these photographs, which are completely available online. If you just Google Gigapan Kiamia, maybe it's easier to spell, but Gigapan Kiamia, you'll find it from there. Charles Sturt University and the work of Timothy Crutchett, the photographer. So from here, another photographer working with Kiamia at the moment is the Australian filmmaker Kim Beamish, who has filmed a feature-length documentary interviewing and working with the tent makers of Cairo in a very observational manner, just letting them speak about life in Egypt after the 2011 revolutions and how it's changed life on the street and their interaction with American quilt makers since then. It's a beautiful documentary, only just recently premiered in New York, and it should be available as well online quite soon. So recommend it as an additional source of information. I think one of the most important future directions of Kiamia, however, is the collaborations with artists, because the tent makers, of course, are constantly creating new designs, but they're only receiving the audiences that already know who tent makers are. Rashid Karachi is very well known as an African, Middle Eastern artist of multiple heritages who collaborates with artisans from around the world to preserve traditional hand skills, making very new work. Rashid Karachi does a lot of work with Sufist references, quite mystical, esoteric references, using a form of calligraphy here, which is his own invention. And that is a banner sewn with black applique on a white background by the tent makers of Cairo. I know this because I've seen the workshops when they're actually making these panels from the series The Invisible Masters. By itself, it's a dramatic artwork. As an installation, it's quite wow, isn't it? Yeah. We're remembering here the architectural heritage of Kiamia, the idea of the grand display, the opulent space, and a movement like this that moves in the breeze as you move under it, of course, is quite wonderful, elevated as it should be. And just to bring a couple of final images to our lecture here today. The very first piece now is a piece by Muhammad Dendon, who recently passed away. What I'm showing you is a piece, the 99 Names of Allah, so a series of calligraphic attributes. That was the last work he made from scratch by hand before he passed away. And he started making it when he realized he was becoming sick. So the work itself is coming together as a final act. Future generations of Kiamia are creating work totally unlike the Khedivals. New era, new audiences, new generations. And finally, there's even one tent maker, Hani Abdelkader, who is responding to the revolution of 2001. It's a very strange object, this, the revolution Kiamia, almost the Guernica of the tent makers of Cairo. But on that note, I'd like to thank you for your time and invite you to ask any questions. Thank you.